peace protesters came from all over the country.
The Women's Peace Camp had been established in 1981 in protest against NATO's decision to site cruise missiles at Greenham Common, a decision endorsed by Mrs. Thatcher. The missiles finally arrived at Greenham in November 1983.
The arrival of cruise missiles on British soil was a carefully thought out process. It was not so much supporting the Americans, it was combating world communism and saying to the Russians, not on our backyard. Now, the Greenham Common ladies were part of a left-wing group. They were feminists, they were people who wanted to change the whole system. They were so much not what Margaret Thatcher believed in or respected. And I think she just waited until they kind of ran out of puff.
Mrs. Thatcher was in no doubt the protest she once described as an increasingly strident unilateralist campaign was of little worth or influence. It was the West's willingness to deploy the missiles that altered the course of negotiation with the Soviet Union, not the actions of the Women's Peace Camp. She was unimpressed.
It worked, of course, because Gorbachev came in 1985. And 4 years later, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. The whole Soviet system collapsed. And one reason why it collapsed was because the Soviet leaders realised that they could not win.
Protest of the violent kind continued with IRA attacks on the mainland, including in October 1984 the bombing of the Grand Hotel in Brighton.
Listen, are they?
Yeah.
Just one question before we go. Was there anyone with you in that room?
No, nobody at all.
Nobody at all in that room?
If the IRA had failed in its attempt to assassinate Mrs. Thatcher, it also failed to derail the conference itself. As scheduled, the Prime Minister addressed delegates later that same day.
The fact that we are gathered here now, shocked but composed and determined, is a sign not only that this attack has failed, but that all attempts to destroy democracy by terrorism will fail.
The response of the Brighton bomb was totally typical, whereas there were many at the time milling around saying, of course, this conference must be abandoned, we cannot go on. She was of entirely the opposite opinion. We must go on. We must show that terrorism won't win. And she was the one who decided right from the time that the masonry was still falling, that they would meet, that we would meet once again that morning to continue with the business of the conference and with the business of government, that the terrorist would not win.
They cheered and stamped their feet for more than 7.5 minutes.
Mrs. Thatcher would later write, "I was not going to appear to be bombed to the negotiating table." Instead, she toughened her position with regard to the ongoing talks with the Republic and parties in the province. But she was far from obsessed by Northern Ireland.
Margaret Thatcher didn't keep her attention all the time on Ireland. She wasn't like John Major or Tony Blair, who really had to live with it day by day. She came back to it at intervals. And it was always slightly difficult because she always started from the beginning. She always started as if nothing had happened until that moment when we were talking. And so you had to go through the whole issue with her again. She was quite attracted by the idea of repartitioning, by drawing the line in a different place. One had to explain over and over again that actually the communities were so mixed up, for example, in Belfast, that there was no line which was neat and tidy. So you had to move through the argument the whole time. And then there was the question about what we were prepared to give the Irish Republic in return for them accepting the crucial point that the future of Northern Ireland should be decided by the people of Northern Ireland and not by anybody else. That was the essential bargain. And the Prime Minister moved towards it. And by the time I left, the bargain wasn't concluded, but it was in sight.
The IRA would continue its campaign of violence. So too, rioting would return to Britain's inner cities. In September 1985, riots broke out in Handsworth in Birmingham and again in Brixton, South London. Both had been triggered by police raids, the one in Brixton following the accidental police shooting of a black woman, Cherry Gross. A month later, there was a similar incident at the Broadwater Farm Estate in Tottenham. 4 policemen raided a flat. They burst through the door, and Cynthia Jarrett, who lived there, died of heart failure. In the trouble that followed, shots were fired at the police for the first time in a riot on the British mainland, and one officer was seriously injured. Shortly afterwards, PC Keith Blakelock was stabbed in the neck while trying to protect firefighters. He later died from his injuries.
In my view, the police made a serious miscalculation when they decided to search the dead woman's home for stolen property, and having found none, the poor woman having died, you can imagine what happened.
I think that she always had a degree of impatience with any kind of civil disorder. I don't think she had any sympathy for what she'd call the bleeding hearts, who said, we don't like this vision of policemen sort of attacking demonstrators. For her, you know, the demonstrators had it coming to them, I think.
I think that there were people there who were out to cause trouble. And of course, if you cause trouble, there will always be somebody, especially in the areas in which they occurred, where it'll escalate a bit. And these were people who are professional agitators. And they always surface when Tory governments were in power.
Well, I'm just taking an assessment of it, and it's quite clear that there's been some outrageous behaviour here. There's been a riot, and the police have contained it, and they seem to have done it rather well.
You're pleased with your men's action so far this evening?
Well, when you get men standing up against petrol bombs with no equipment here to repel it, I think you must put this down as the most restrained police force in the world.
Reported as the worst rioting seen in mainland Britain, commentators seized on the event as indicative of a government and a society that had turned its back on the deep-seated social deprivation in its midst.
Alienated youth, frustrated youth, youth feeling that it didn't have any voice that was going to be noticed, felt that it had a right to resort to violence. It didn't. But that was the feeling. And then, of course, after the first brick is thrown, the first petrol bomb is thrown, events look after themselves.
For Mrs. Thatcher, nothing could justify the violence or the attacks on the police. But while she condemned the rioting, and while her priority in office would remain the economy, during Mrs. Thatcher's second and third terms, the government did start to address social policy. The Prime Minister's advisers even dubbed the policy social Thatcherism.
She was very robust about anything connected with disorder, whether it was in the miners' strike, most famously, or in the city riots. She was perfectly prepared to look at the causes, but she was not prepared to tolerate outbreaks of violence.
1985 also saw further moves on Northern Ireland. Given all that had gone before, it was a tribute to Margaret Thatcher that she was still determined to find a solution to the Troubles. After various initiatives and lots of diplomatic activity between London and Dublin, by November they were ready to sign the Anglo-Irish Agreement. For the first time it allowed the Dublin government to have a say in affairs north of the border, although without power over decisions.
We protest most vehemently that you are negotiating the affairs and future of Northern Ireland with a foreign government which not only claims our territory, but harbours the murderers of our people.
Unionist MPs first threatened and later resigned in protest at a treaty they simply didn't trust.
Unionists would cease cooperation with government ministers and resign their seats unless a summit referendum was held.
Should Parliament proceed to approve this deal without first consulting the people of Northern Ireland, we will invite all Unionist members of the House of Commons to resign their seats forthwith.
Margaret Thatcher may not have succeeded in Northern Ireland, but she did start the process of involving the Republic, setting the model for later negotiations, culminating with the Good Friday Agreement.
I think the Anglo-Irish Agreement was the original bedrock of the whole peace process, and I think, to be fair, it was owed as much to civil servants on both sides as it was to politicians. And she allowed it to happen. I don't think she was a great enthusiast for it, and she went along with it, as it were, and all credit for her doing that.
Where terrorism, riots and peaceful protest had seemingly left the Iron Lady unmoved, it was events within her own cabinet shortly after that did most to disturb Mrs. Thatcher's composure.